The icy wind howled through the cracks of Catherine Miller's dilapidated cabin like a hungry wolf, making the single candle flame dance wildly across the rough-hewn walls. Her 6-month-old daughter, Emma, whimpered against her chest. Tiny fingers blue with cold despite being wrapped in every scrap of fabric Catherine could spare. Outside, the Montana winter of 1876 showed no mercy, and inside, hope was running as thin as the firewood pile that had dwindled to nothing but splinters and dust. "Hush now, little one," Catherine whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. "Mom has got you." But the tremor in her voice betrayed the fear that had settled deep in her bones, heavier than the snow blanketing the world outside her door. 3 weeks a widow, Catherine had watched helplessly as influenza had stolen her husband James in the night, leaving her alone with an infant and a homestead too large for a single woman's hands. The last of the neighbors had stopped checking on her days ago, themselves battling the cruel winter that had descended earlier and harsher than anyone had predicted. Emma's cries grew more insistent, her little body shivering despite being pressed against her mother's chest. Catherine fought back tears as she rocked back and forth on the edge of the bed, her own stomach empty and aching. The milk for her baby was growing scarce, her body unable to produce enough as her own strength waned with each passing day. "Just hold on," she murmured, pressing chapped lips to her daughter's forehead. "Tomorrow will be better." It was the same promise she'd made yesterday and the day before that. When the knock came at the door, Catherine thought she might have imagined it a trick of the wind or perhaps her mind slipping away with the cold. But it came again, more insistent, and Emma's eyes opened at the sound. Catherine rose shakily to her feet, clutching Emma tightly as she moved toward the door. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, stiff and clumsy with cold. The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and snowflakes that stung her cheeks. Through the swirling white, a tall figure loomed, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a Stetson. "Madam," the deep voice said, "I'm mighty sorry to trouble you, but my horse pulled up lame a half-mile back." "I saw your chimney," and the man stopped mid-sentence, his eyes taking in Catherine's trembling form and the silent cabin behind her. "You got no fire," he stated plainly, his gaze moving to the baby in her arms. "No wood," Catherine managed, her voice cracking from disuse. "We're fine, though." Pride, the last thing she owned outright, made her lie even as Emma began to cry again, the sound weak and heartbreaking. The stranger stepped forward, and Catherine noticed for the first time the bundle of firewood strapped to his back. Without asking permission, he moved past her into the cabin, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Name's Blake Callahan," he said, already kneeling at the hearth, arranging logs with practiced efficiency. "And with all due respect, madam, you and that little one are about as far from fine as can be." Catherine watched, clutching Emma to her chest, as Blake struck a match and coaxed a small flame to life. His hands were large but moved with surprising gentleness among the kindling. Within minutes, the fire had caught, casting a warm glow across the barren room. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping closer to the growing warmth, her body drawn to it instinctively. Blake stood, removing his hat to reveal a shock of dark hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. His face, weathered by sun and wind, softened as he looked at Emma. "How long you been without heat?" he asked, his voice low. 2 days, Catherine admitted. "The wood ran out and I couldn't. I can't leave her to get more." Blake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as he shrugged out of his heavy coat a worn but substantial duster lined with wool. In one fluid motion, he draped it around Catherine's shoulders, enveloping both her and Emma in its warmth and the lingering scent of leather, horse, and pine. "Sir, I can't. You can and you will," he interrupted gently. "That little one needs warming up proper." His strong arms came around them both, holding the coat closed while careful not to crowd them. The sudden cocoon of warmth made Catherine's eyes fill with tears she'd been too cold to shed for days. Emma's cries quieted almost immediately, her tiny body relaxing as the warmth from Blake's coat and the nearness of his solid presence surrounded them. "There now," he murmured, his breath stirring Catherine's hair. "That's better, isn't it, little miss?" They stood that way for long moments, a strange tableau of necessity and kindness. Catherine felt herself leaning into him, her exhaustion making her knees weak. Without a word, Blake guided her to the chair nearest the fire, still keeping his arms around them both. "When's the last time you ate, madam?" he asked, his voice rumbling against her back. "Catherine," she said. "My name is Catherine Miller, and yesterday, I think. There's not much left." Blake nodded, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Well, Catherine Miller, it seems the good Lord sent me your way tonight. I've got provisions in my saddlebags, not fancy but filling. Your horse, you said it was lame." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Bertha's got a stone bruise is all. She'll be right as rain after a night's rest. I stabled her in your lean-to, hope you don't mind." "No, of course not." Catherine looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep, her cheeks already regaining some color. "We don't have much, but you're welcome to stay until your horse is better." Blake's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding of sorts. "I'd be obliged," he said simply. "Now, let me see about getting some food into you." While still keeping his coat wrapped around mother and child, Blake managed to retrieve his saddlebags from where he'd dropped them by the door. From within, he produced dried meat, hardtack, and a small jar of preserved Peach's Trail rations, but to Catherine, they might as well have been a feast from heaven. "I can't take your food," she protested weakly, even as her stomach clenched at the sight. "You're not taking it." "I'm sharing it," Blake corrected, his tone brooking no argument. "Besides, a man traveling alone eats better when he's got company." He moved with efficiency around the small cabin, finding a pot to heat water, locating a tin of coffee that Catherine had been saving. The domestic ease with which he navigated the space might have seemed presumptuous from another man, but from Blake, it felt like salvation. As warmth slowly returned to Catherine's limbs, and the gnawing hunger began to subside with each careful bite of food, she studied her unexpected savior. His clothes, while dusty from the trail, were of good quality. The gun at his hip was worn but well maintained, and his manner spoke of a man accustomed to both solitude and command. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mr. Callahan," she observed as he poured her a cup of the fragrant coffee. "Blake," he corrected. "And yes, I suppose I am. Was heading to Helena on business when the storm kicked up." He settled into the chair opposite her, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "What about you, Catherine? Where's your man?" The blunt question might have offended her from someone else, but Blake's tone held nothing but genuine concern. "In the ground behind the cabin," she answered quietly. 3 weeks now. Influenza." Blake's expression darkened. "I'm sorry. That's a hard blow, especially with a little one." Catherine nodded, unconsciously tightening her hold on Emma. "James was a good man. We came out here from Ohio 2 years ago. He had dreams of building something lasting." She looked around the modest cabin. "We were making progress until winter came early and sickness followed," Blake finished for her. "Yes." They fell into silence then, the crackling of the fire and Emma's soft breathing the only sounds in the cabin. Catherine felt her eyelids growing heavy, the combination of warmth, food, and bone-deep exhaustion pulling her toward sleep. "You should rest," Blake said, rising from his chair. "I'll keep the fire going. But where will you sleep?" Catherine asked, suddenly aware that the cabin offered only her bed and James's old chair. Blake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I've bedded down in worse places than a warm cabin floor, Catherine. Don't you worry about me." As if to prove his point, he unrolled his bedroll near the hearth, arranging it with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to making camp, wherever night found him. Catherine should have felt uncomfortable, a strange man in her home, the impropriety of it all, but instead, a profound relief washed over her. For the first time since James had drawn his last breath, she wasn't alone against the wilderness and the winter. "Thank you," she whispered, rising carefully with Emma still nestled in the warmth of Blake's coat. "For everything." Blake's eyes met hers across the small space, something unspoken passing between them. "Get some rest, Catherine. Tomorrow will be better." And for the first time in weeks, Catherine believed those words might actually be true. When Catherine woke the next morning, the cabin was warmer than it had been in days. She lay still for a moment, savoring the feeling of not shivering before her eyes flew open with the memory of the night before. Emma was still asleep beside her, peaceful and pink-cheeked, wrapped in Blake's coat which he had insisted they keep through the night. The smell of coffee and something cooking pulled her fully awake. She sat up to see Blake standing at the small iron stove, his back to her as he worked. "Morning," he said without turning around, as if he'd sensed her watching. "Hope you don't mind, but I found some flour and a few potatoes that were still good. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." Catherine swung her legs over the side of the bed, adjusting her rumpled dress as best she could. "You didn't have to do that." Now Blake did turn, a half smile on his face. "Wasn't no trouble. Been up since dawn anyway. Checked on Bertha, she's doing better, but could use another day off that foot." Catherine nodded, suddenly shy in the morning light. The man who had seemed like a guardian angel in the desperate cold of last night was now very real and very male in the small confines of her cabin. "There's water heated if you want to wash up," Blake said, gesturing to a basin he'd placed on the small table. "I'll step outside while you get yourself sorted." Before Catherine could respond, he'd grabbed his hat and was out the door, leaving her alone with the luxury of warm water and privacy. She washed quickly, changed Emma's wrappings, and did her best to make herself presentable with the limited resources at hand. Her hair, once her pride with its copper waves, was dull and tangled, but she managed to twist it into a knot at the nape of her neck. When Blake returned, stamping snow from his boots, Catherine had Emma in her arms and was standing by the stove, inhaling the unfamiliar but welcome scent of hot food. "You've been busy this morning," she observed, noticing for the first time the stack of firewood by the hearth that hadn't been there the night before. "Found your axe under a drift and figured I'd make myself useful." He ladled a generous portion of the potato pancakes onto a plate and handed it to her. "Sit and eat while it's hot." Catherine complied, settling into the chair with Emma on her lap. The first bite nearly made her moan aloud. Simple as it was, it tasted like the finest restaurant fare to her deprived senses. "This is wonderful," she said, taking another bite. "I haven't had a hot breakfast since." She trailed off, the memory of James cooking their last meal together suddenly vivid and painful. Blake, seeming to sense her shift in mood, changed the subject. "That's a fine little girl you've got there. What's her name?" "Emma," Catherine replied, grateful for the diversion. "Emma Rose Miller. She's 6 months old." Blake smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. She has your eyes, clear as mountain lakes. Catherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Thank you. She has her father's chin, though stubborn as the day is long. Blake chuckled, serving himself a plate and sitting across from her. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, until Catherine gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind since the night before. What takes you to Helena, if you don't mind my asking? Blake took a sip of coffee before answering. Business with the land office. I've got a spread about 60 miles southeast of here, nothing grand, but it's growing. Been saving to add the adjacent parcel now that old man Thornton's moving back east. You're a rancher then, started that way. These days I do a bit of everything, run cattle, break horses, guide the occasional hunting party. Whatever pays. He shrugged as if his versatility was nothing remarkable. What about you? You planning to stay on here? The question caught Catherine off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the next day, the next meal since James died. I don't know, she admitted. James had such dreams for this place, but without him. She looked around the small cabin. I'm not sure I can manage it alone. Blake's eyes held hers, his gaze steady and thoughtful. It's hard country for a woman alone, that's certain truth. But you've got grit, Catherine Miller. I can see that plain as day. His words warmed her more than they should have. Grit doesn't chop wood or mend fences, she said pragmatically. No, but it keeps you standing when others would fall. Blake set down his empty plate. Tell you what, while I'm here waiting on Bertha's hoof, maybe I can help get some things squared away. Winter's set in hard, but there's plenty can be done to make things easier for you. Catherine wanted to refuse, her pride bristling at the idea of charity. But Emma shifted in her arms, a reminder of the responsibility that outweighed pride. I can't pay you, she said finally. Blake waved a hand dismissively. Not looking for payment, just being neighborly. 60 miles is a long way to call someone a neighbor, Catherine pointed out, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. Out here, that's practically next door. Blake's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, Catherine noticed. Besides, way I see it, the good Lord put me on your doorstep for a reason. Might be that reason is to chop some wood and fix whatever needs fixing. And fix things he did. Over the next 3 days, as his horse recovered from its stone bruise, Blake Callahan transformed Catherine's homestead. He repaired the leaking roof, reinforced the lean to where the cow and his horse were sheltered, split enough firewood to last a month, and somehow managed to patch the drafty windows with materials he seemed to conjure from thin air. Catherine found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the efficient way he moved, the quiet competence in his hands. He spoke little about himself, deflecting personal questions with good humor, or changing the subject to ask about Emma or the homestead. But in the evenings, as they sat by the fire after Emma was asleep, Blake began to share stories of his travels, painting vivid pictures of the territories he'd seen. The mountains in Colorado will take your breath away, he told her on the second night, his voice low and melodic in the firelight. All purple and gold in the sunset, stretching up like they're trying to touch heaven itself. It sounds beautiful, Catherine said, trying to imagine such grandeur. Ohio had its own beauty, but nothing like what Blake described. It is. But Montana. Blake's eyes took on a distant look. There's something about this land that gets under your skin. The open spaces make a man feel like he can breathe for the first time. Or they make a woman feel terribly small and alone, Catherine added softly. Blake's gaze returned to her, sharp and perceptive. Is that how you feel? Small and alone, Catherine looked into the fire, choosing her words carefully. When James was alive, this place felt like possibility. Now it feels like a trap, too big to manage, too isolated to leave easily, especially with Emma. Where would you go if you could? Blake asked. The question hung in the air between them. Catherine had asked herself the same thing countless times since becoming a widow. Back east, maybe, to family, or perhaps to one of the growing towns where I could find work. As what? I was a school teacher before I married James, she admitted. I loved it, the children, the books, seeing minds open to new ideas. Something flickered across Blake's face, surprise, perhaps, or approval. A teacher, I can see that about you. Can you? Catherine asked, curious about what this man, still largely a stranger despite their forced intimacy, saw when he looked at her. You have a way about you, thoughtful, observant, and patient, which any teacher needs in spades. Blake stretched his long legs toward the fire. The settlement near my ranch could use a teacher. Lots of families moving in, children growing up wild as weeds. Catherine's heart quickened at the casual suggestion. Are you offering me a position, Mr. Callahan? Blake's slow smile made something flutter in her chest. Just thinking aloud, Mrs. Miller, but it's not the worst idea I've ever had. On the morning of the fourth day, Catherine woke to find Blake already dressed and packing his few belongings. The sight sent an unexpected pang through her heart. Bertha's foot is healed, he said when he noticed her watching. And that business in Helena won't wait forever. Of course, Catherine replied, struggling to keep her voice neutral. You've been more than kind to stay as long as you have. Blake paused in his preparations, studying her face. I'll be coming back this way in about a week. Would it be all right if I checked in on you and Emma? Relief flooded through Catherine, though she tried not to show it too plainly. We would welcome the company. As Blake fastened his saddlebags, Catherine impulsively reached for the coat he had lent her that first night, the coat that had sheltered her and Emma from the bitter cold. Your coat, she said, holding it out to him. I never properly thanked you for it. Blake looked at the coat, then at her, his blue eyes serious. Keep it for now. Weather's still fierce and I've got another in my pack. I couldn't possibly, please, he interrupted gently. It would ease my mind knowing you had it, just in case the wood runs low again before I get back. The concern in his voice touched Catherine deeply. It had been so long since anyone had worried about her welfare. Thank you, she said simply, clutching the coat to her chest. Blake nodded, seemingly satisfied, then reached into his pocket. One more thing, he said, producing a folded piece of paper. Map to my ranch. If anything happens, anything at all, you head there. My foreman, Hank, knows to expect you if I'm not around. Catherine took the map with trembling fingers. You hardly know us. I know enough, Blake replied, his voice firm. I know you're a good woman in a hard situation. I know that little girl deserves every chance. And I know that out here, folks look out for each other or nobody survives. With those words, he donned his hat and stepped toward the door. Catherine followed, Emma in her arms, to see him off. Outside, the morning was crisp but clear, the storm having moved on to reveal a landscape transformed by snow. Blake's horse, Bertha, stood saddled and ready, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Blake checked the cinch one last time, then turned to face Catherine and Emma. For a moment, he simply looked at them as if committing their faces to memory. 1 week, he said finally. I'll bring supplies. We'll be here, Catherine promised. Blake nodded, then surprised her by reaching out to touch Emma's cheek with a gentle finger. You be good for your mama, little miss. To Catherine, he said nothing more, but his eyes conveyed what words could not: concern, respect, and something else that made her heart beat faster. With a fluid movement that spoke of years in the saddle, Blake mounted Bertha and tipped his hat. Until next week, Mrs. Miller. Until then, Mr. Callahan, Catherine replied, holding Emma a little tighter as they watched him ride away, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast white landscape. Only when he had disappeared from sight did Catherine realize she was still clutching his coat with her free hand, as if it were a talisman against the loneliness that already threatened to engulf her once more. "He'll be back," she whispered to Emma, who gurgled in response. "And until then, we'll manage. We always do." But as she turned to go back inside the cabin warmer, safer, and better stocked than it had been in weeks thanks to Blake's efforts, Catherine found herself counting the days until his return in a way that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the unexpected warmth his presence had kindled within her. The weeks stretched before Catherine like an eternity. Though Blake had left her with ample firewood, repaired windows that kept the worst of the drafts at bay, and provisions enough to see her through until his promised return, his absence left a void that surprised her with its depth. Each night, as she tucked Emma into bed, Catherine found herself wrapping them both in Blake's coat, inhaling the lingering scent of him leather, tobacco, and something indefinably male that clung to the wool lining. It was improper, perhaps, to find such comfort in a garment belonging to a man she barely knew, but propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. On the third day after Blake's departure, a Chinook wind swept through, temporarily melting the top layer of snow and revealing patches of the dormant earth beneath. Catherine seized the opportunity to venture outside beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin, Emma bundled against her chest in a sling fashioned from one of James's old shirts. The cow, a patient Jersey named Butter that James had purchased the previous spring, lowed softly as Catherine entered the lean-to. Blake had reinforced the structure and laid fresh hay, ensuring the animal's comfort during his stay. "Hello, old girl," Catherine murmured, running a hand along the cow's flank. "Feeling better with a proper roof over your head, aren't you?" Butter's milk production had dwindled with the poor feed available, but she still provided enough to supplement Catherine's own milk for Emma, a blessing that had likely kept the baby alive during the worst days before Blake's arrival. As Catherine milked the cow, her thoughts turned again to the tall stranger who had appeared at her door like an answer to an unspoken prayer. There was something about Blake Callahan that inspired trust, despite his reticence about his past. His hands were calloused from work, but they moved with gentle precision whether repairing a roof beam or holding Emma while Catherine cooked their evening meal. And he had held Emma with a natural ease that spoke of experience rather than the awkward handling most unmarried men displayed around infants. When Catherine had commented on it, Blake had simply said, "Had a sister with 4 little ones back in Texas. I helped out when I could." It was one of the few personal details he had shared, and Catherine had stored it away like a precious gem, adding it to the small collection of facts she knew about him. He was from Texas originally. He had run cattle drives up from the South before settling in Montana. He'd fought for the Confederacy during the war but didn't care to speak of it. And despite his apparent self-sufficiency, there was a loneliness about him that matched her own. With the milk pail half full a better yield than yesterday, Catherine made her way back to the cabin, carefully navigating the slick patches where snow had melted and refrozen. As she approached the door, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. A wolf stood at the tree line, its gray coat nearly invisible against the winter backdrop. It watched her with unblinking yellow eyes, motionless except for the plume of breath that escaped its jaws. Emma chose that moment to squirm against Catherine's chest, letting out a small cry of protest at being confined in the sling for too long. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound. Catherine's mouth went dry with fear. Slowly, she set down the milk pail and backed toward the cabin door, never taking her eyes off the predator. Her hand fumbled behind her for the latch, fingers clumsy with terror. The wolf took a step forward, then another, its powerful shoulders rolling beneath its thick fur. Catherine's back hit the cabin wall, the door latch still frustratingly out of reach. "Go away," she whispered hoarsely, as if the creature could understand her desperate plea. "Please go away." Emma began to cry in earnest now, her wails piercing the still winter air. The wolf paused, head tilted as if considering this new development. In that moment of hesitation, a gunshot cracked across the clearing. The wolf flinched, then turned and loped back into the trees without a backward glance. Catherine whirled toward the sound of the shot, her arms tightening protectively around Emma. From the far side of the clearing, a rider approached at a gallop, rifle in hand. Even at a distance, she recognized the broad shoulders and distinctive hat. "Blake," she breathed, relief making her knees weak. He reined his horse to a stop before her, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "No, we're fine. You came back early." Catherine couldn't keep the relief from her voice. Blake's expression softened as he holstered his rifle. "Got my business done quicker than expected. Good thing, too." He glanced toward the trees where the wolf had disappeared. That fella looked hungry. "I've never seen one so close to the cabin before," Catherine admitted, her heart still racing. "James said they usually avoid people." "Hungry winter makes for bold predators," Blake replied grimly. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The admonishment stung Catherine's pride. "I've been alone for weeks, Mr. Callahan. One wolf won't change that." Blake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more on the subject. Instead, he bent to retrieve the milk pail she had abandoned. "Let's get you both inside. There's a storm brewing to the north another day, maybe less, before it hits." As if to confirm his words, a cold gust of wind swept across the clearing, making Emma burrow deeper into her mother's warmth. Catherine shivered, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they truly were despite her brave words. Inside the cabin, Blake set about rebuilding the fire while Catherine settled Emma and strained the milk. The domestic rhythm they fell into felt strangely natural, as if they had been sharing this space for years rather than days. "I brought supplies," Blake said as he stoked the flames higher. "Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, pork enough to last a while, and something else I thought might be useful." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped package. Catherine accepted it curiously, unwrapping the fabric to reveal a pistol smaller than Blake's sidearm, but well-crafted and gleaming with oil. "I can't take this," she said automatically, though her fingers tightened around the grip as if reluctant to let it go. "You can and you will," Blake replied, echoing his words from their first meeting. "It's a Remington pocket model small enough for a woman's hand but powerful enough to stop a wolf, or a man with bad intentions." Catherine looked up sharply at that. "Have you heard something?" Blake shook his head. "No, nothing specific, but these hills get all sorts hiding out come winter deserters, outlaws, men on the run from whatever's chasing them. Most are just trying to survive, same as anyone, but—" He left the sentence unfinished, his meaning clear enough. Catherine examined the pistol with newfound appreciation. James had owned a rifle, which still hung above the door, but he had never thought to teach her how to use it. The revolver felt different, a weapon she might actually handle with some confidence. "I don't know how to shoot," she admitted. "I'll teach you," Blake promised. "Tomorrow, weather permitting." That evening, as snow began to fall again outside, Blake and Catherine sat before the fire with Emma sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The approaching storm had brought an early darkness, and the single lamp cast long shadows across the cabin walls. "I've been thinking about what you said," Blake began, his voice low so as not to disturb the baby. "About feeling trapped here. Catherine glanced up, surprised that he had remembered their conversation so clearly. "It was just talk. Widow's melancholy, I suppose." Blake shook his head. "No, it was honest. And you were right, this is too much for one person, especially with a child to care for." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I've got a proposition for you, Catherine." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "What kind of proposition?" "Come to my ranch," he said simply. "There's a cabin smaller than this one, but sound. It was built for the previous owner's mother, sits about 100 yards from the main house. You and Emma would have privacy, but not isolation." Catherine stared at him, speechless. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. Blake continued, his eyes intent on her face. "The settlement I mentioned is about 3 miles away, growing every month with new families. They're desperate for a teacher. You could have your independence, Emma would be safe, and you'd be doing work you love." "Why?" Catherine asked finally, finding her voice. "Why would you do this for us?" Blake's gaze dropped to Emma, then back to Catherine's face. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because that little girl deserves a chance at life, and so do you. And because," he stopped, then continued more quietly, "because I know what it is to be alone when the world turns cold." The simple honesty in his words moved Catherine deeply. She looked down at Emma, sleeping trustingly in her arms, unaware of how precarious their situation truly was. The winter had barely begun, and already they had nearly succumbed to its fury once. Without Blake's intervention, they might not survive until spring. And yet, to accept his offer meant placing her trust and her future in the hands of a man she had known for less than a week. A man who, for all his kindness, remained largely a mystery to her. "I need time to think," she said finally. Blake nodded, unsurprised. "Of course, it's no small decision." He rose from his chair, stretching his tall frame. "But Catherine, don't think too long. That storm's coming, and it's going to be a bad one." As if to emphasize his words, the wind outside rose to a howl, rattling the newly repaired windows and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "How bad?" Catherine asked, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawling up her spine. Blake's expression was grim in the firelight. "Bad enough that I'm glad I got back when I did. Bad enough that, when it passes, we need to be ready to ride out, whether to my ranch or somewhere else with more people and more resources than this isolated patch can provide." The stark reality of his assessment hung in the air between them. Catherine looked around the cabin that had been her home for 2 years, the home where she and James had planned their future, where Emma had been born, where she had become both a mother and a widow within the space of 6 months. Could she really leave it all behind? And if not, could she truly survive here alone? With Emma still cradled in one arm, Catherine reached out her free hand to Blake, who took it without hesitation. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, a working man's hand that had already done more for her than she could ever repay. "Tell me about your ranch," she said softly. "Tell me everything." And as the storm gathered strength outside, Blake Callahan painted a picture of a life Catherine had never imagined for herself, a life of open skies and rolling grassland, of a small but growing community, of purpose and possibility rather than mere survival. By the time they retired for the night, Blake to his bedroll near the fire, Catherine to her bed with Emma, the seed of a new future had been planted in her heart, taking root alongside the grief and fear that had been her only companions for too long. Morning brought confirmation of Blake's weather sense. The storm had descended in full fury overnight, a howling white monster that obliterated the world beyond the cabin windows. The wind found every crack and crevice despite Blake's repairs, sending small drifts of snow creeping beneath the door and around the window frames. "We're not going anywhere today," Blake observed grimly as he stoked the fire higher. "Or tomorrow, from the look of it." Catherine nodded, feeding Emma with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Being snowbound with Blake Callahan presented a new set of concerns that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with propriety. What would people think if they knew she was sharing her small cabin with a man who was neither relative nor husband? But then, she reminded herself, there was no one close enough to think anything at all. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and likely as trapped by the storm as they were. "Will your people at the ranch worry?" she asked, adjusting her shawl more modestly as Emma finished nursing. Blake shrugged, keeping his eyes politely averted. "Hank knows I can handle myself, but he'll wonder if I don't show up in the next few days." The storm kept them confined for 3 days, during which time Catherine came to know Blake Callahan better than she might have in weeks of normal interaction. Proximity bred a peculiar intimacy not physical, for Blake maintained a scrupulous respect for her space and privacy, but an intimacy of shared routine, of conversation that deepened as the hours passed, of silences that grew comfortable rather than strained. She learned that he had left Texas after the war with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. Unwilling to live under Reconstruction policies, he considered punitive and unjust. He had worked cattle drives north for 5 years, saving every penny until he could purchase his small Montana ranch. It was nothing but a lined shack and 100 acres of overgrazed pasture when I bought it, he told her as they sat playing checkers with a set he had carved from firewood to pass the time. "Now it's up to 800 acres, 40 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and a house I built with my own hands." "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time," Catherine observed, jumping one of his pieces. Blake's smile held a hint of pride. "Hard work and clean living," he said, then added with a wink, "most of the time anyway." Catherine found herself laughing, a sound so foreign to her ears that it startled Emma, who was playing on a blanket near the fire. "You should do that more often," Blake said, his eyes warm as they met hers across the checkerboard. "What? Lose at checkers?" "Laugh," he clarified. "It suits you." The simple compliment brought heat to Catherine's cheeks, and she busied herself with the game to hide her reaction. She wasn't ready to examine too closely the effect this man had on her, the way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched, or how she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the strong line of his jaw or the gentle way he handled Emma. It was too soon after James. Too complicated, too uncertain, and yet, as the storm finally began to abate on the 4th day, Catherine had made her decision. "I'll come to your ranch," she told Blake as they stood at the window, watching the snow taper off to reveal a transformed landscape. Drifts taller than a man had formed against the side of the cabin, and the lean-to was barely visible beneath its white blanket. Blake turned to her, his expression carefully neutral despite the flash of something like relief in his eyes. "You're sure?" Catherine nodded, holding Emma close. "This place was James's dream, not mine. I came here for him and I've stayed out of inertia, I suppose, or fear of change." She looked around the cabin one last time. "But Emma deserves more than survival. She deserves a life with possibilities." "And you?" Blake asked quietly. "What do you deserve, Catherine?" The question caught her off guard. For so long, her own wants and needs had been secondary, first to James's dream of homesteading, then to the all-consuming task of keeping Emma alive after his death. What did she want for herself? "A chance," she said finally. "A chance to be more than just someone's widow trying to hold back the wilderness alone." Blake's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, warm and steady. "You'll have that chance, I promise you." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm spent at last. Blake spent the early hours digging paths through the snow to the lean-to, and retrieving his horse, which had weathered the storm in reasonable comfort thanks to the reinforced shelter and extra hay. Catherine packed what she could clothes for herself and Emma, a few cherished books, the small wooden box containing her wedding ring and James's pocket watch, and the family Bible with their names recorded inside. Everything else would have to stay behind. "We can send for the rest in spring," Blake assured her as he lashed her trunk to the back of his sturdy packhorse. "Or you can sell it all and start fresh. Your choice." The idea of such freedom, such agency over her own life was still new enough to make Catherine's head spin. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, Emma wrapped snugly against her chest, and took one last look at the place that had been both haven and prison. "Goodbye, James," she whispered, knowing her husband wasn't really there but feeling the need to acknowledge the life they had shared, however briefly. Blake approached, leading his saddled horse. "Ready?" Catherine nodded, steeling herself for the journey ahead. Blake had explained that it would take most of the day to reach his ranch, even traveling as light as possible. The snow would slow them down, and they would need to be vigilant for drifts and hidden hazards beneath the pristine white surface. "Emma will ride with me," Blake said, reaching for the baby. "She'll be warmer that way, and it'll be easier on Bertha if you ride alone." Catherine hesitated only briefly before handing over her daughter. Blake settled Emma securely inside his coat, just as he had done with both of them that first night, and then helped Catherine mount the packhorse. "It's not the most comfortable saddle," he apologized, "but Samson here is steady as they come. He'll get you there safe." With one last look at the cabin, Catherine turned her face toward the southeast and the promise of a new beginning. Blake led the way, breaking trail through the deep snow, with Emma's small face just visible within the shelter of his coat. The journey was arduous, despite Blake's careful navigation. The snow transformed familiar landmarks, and twice they had to detour around drifts too deep to safely cross. By midday, Catherine's thighs ached from the unaccustomed posture of riding, and her fingers were numb despite the thick gloves Blake had insisted she wear. They stopped briefly in a sheltered grove of pines to rest the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and hardtack. Blake passed Emma back to Catherine so the baby could nurse, discreetly turning his attention to the horses while mother and daughter shared this intimate moment. "How much farther?" Catherine asked when Emma had finished and Blake had taken her back, tucking the now sleepy infant securely against his chest. "Another 4 hours if the trail stays clear," he replied, studying the sky with a practiced eye. "Weather's holding, so we should make it before dark." Catherine nodded, too tired to speak further. She had thought herself strong after months of managing alone, but this journey was testing the limits of her endurance. As they remounted and continued their slow progress, Catherine found her thoughts drifting to the uncertain future awaiting her at Blake's ranch. Would his foreman and the other hands accept her presence? Would the settlement truly need a teacher? And most pressingly, what exactly was her relationship to Blake in this new arrangement? He had been careful to emphasize that she would have her own cabin, her independence. But she wasn't naive enough to think that others wouldn't speculate about why a widowed woman with a baby had taken up residence on a bachelor rancher's property. The question gnawed at her as the afternoon wore on, and the landscape gradually changed from deep forest to rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and aspen. In the distance, Catherine could make out the faint smudge of smoke against the sky, signs of habitation after miles of wilderness. "Is that your ranch?" she asked, pointing. Blake followed her gesture and shook his head. "That's the settlement Silver Creek. My place is another 2 miles beyond in that valley." He indicated a dip between two gentle slopes ahead. As they drew closer, Catherine began to see evidence of Blake's description: a large cabin set against the backdrop of a pine-covered hill, several outbuildings, a corral containing dark shapes that must be horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the cold air. "Home," Blake said simply, a note of pride in his voice that Catherine hadn't heard before. The word struck her with unexpected force. Home. How long had it been since she had truly felt at home anywhere? The cabin she had just left had been James's dream, never fully hers. And Ohio seemed a lifetime away, a place belonging to a different Catherine altogether. As they approached the ranch yard, a tall, lean man emerged from one of the outbuildings. He raised a hand in greeting, then stopped short at the sight of Catherine and the bundle Blake carried. "That's Hank," Blake explained. "Best foreman a man could ask for, and the nearest thing I have to family out here." Hank approached cautiously, his weathered face a study in carefully controlled surprise. "Boss," he said by way of greeting, his eyes moving from Blake to Catherine and back again. "Didn't expect company." "Hank, this is Mrs. Catherine Miller and her daughter Emma," Blake said, dismounting with practiced ease despite the precious cargo he carried. "They'll be staying in Martha's cabin." Hank's eyebrows rose slightly, but he touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Madam." "Little miss." He turned back to Blake. "Martha's cabin hasn't been opened since last spring, might need some airing out." "We'll see to it," Blake replied, helping Catherine down from her horse. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground, stiff from the long ride. Blake's hand steadied her elbow, his touch lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Welcome to Callahan Ranch, Catherine," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Looking up at the sturdy cabin with its welcoming curl of smoke, at the well-maintained outbuildings and the careful order of the ranch yard, Catherine felt something unfamiliar stir within her, not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. A sense of possibility. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it for more than just the welcome. Blake's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Emma squirmed against his chest, breaking the moment. "Let's get you both inside," he said, his voice returning to its normal register. "There'll be time enough for a proper tour tomorrow." As they walked toward the main cabin, Catherine noticed Hank watching them with undisguised curiosity. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly. Whatever gossip or speculation might follow her arrival, she would face it with dignity. She had survived grief, isolation, and the Montana winter at its cruelest. She could certainly survive wagging tongues. Blake's home was a revelation larger than Catherine had expected, with a main room featuring a massive stone fireplace, a well-appointed kitchen, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was neat and solidly built, from the plank flooring to the sturdy furniture, much of which showed signs of Blake's own craftsmanship. "It's lovely," Catherine said honestly, warming her hands by the fire while Blake settled Emma on a blanket he spread before the hearth. "It suits me," Blake replied, though she could tell her approval pleased him. "Not fancy, but comfortable. Martha's cabin is similar, just smaller." "Who was Martha?" Catherine asked, realizing she had never heard Blake mention this woman before. "Old Mr. Thornton's mother," Blake explained. "She lived here until she passed 2 years ago. The cabin's been empty since." Relief washed through Catherine, followed immediately by embarrassment at her reaction. What difference did it make who Martha was? It wasn't as though she had any claim on Blake Callahan's past, or his present, for that matter. Hank appeared at the door, stomping snow from his boots. "Got a fire going in the small cabin, boss. Should be warmed up enough to move the lady and the little one over there after supper." "Much obliged, Hank," Blake said. "Mrs. Miller and Emma will be joining us for the meal if that's all right with you." The foreman's face remained impassive, but Catherine thought she detected a gleam of curiosity in his eyes. "No trouble at all. Stew's been simmering since noon, plenty to go around." After Hank withdrew, Blake turned to Catherine with an apologetic smile. "He's not much for conversation, but he's the best man I know in a pinch, and he makes a fine venison stew, he seems." "Surprised by our arrival," Catherine observed carefully. Blake chuckled. "That's putting it mildly. I don't make a habit of bringing women back to the ranch, especially not with babies in tow." His expression softened as he looked at Emma, who was contentedly playing with a wooden spoon he had given her. "But then, I've never met anyone quite like you two before." The simple statement, delivered without artifice or apparent intent to charm, nevertheless sent a warm flush through Catherine's tired body. Before she could formulate a response, Blake continued, "I should check on the horses and let you rest a bit before supper. Make yourself at home, there's coffee on the stove if you'd like some." After he had gone, Catherine sank into a chair by the fire, her body finally registering the full extent of the day's exertions. Emma, surprisingly, seemed energized by the new surroundings, crawling on the blanket and babbling happily to herself. "Well, little one," Catherine murmured, watching her daughter explore, "we've certainly landed in a strange new world, haven't we?" But as she looked around the warm, solid cabin with its evidence of care and craftsmanship, Catherine couldn't help but feel that perhaps this strange new world might become something more, something like home. Supper that evening was a simple but hearty affair: venison stew rich with vegetables, fresh bread that Hank had apparently baked that morning in anticipation of Blake's return, and even a dried apple pie that the foreman produced with unexpected ceremony. "Sunday tradition," Blake explained as Hank cut generous slices. "Hank was a cook for a cattle outfit before he joined me. Man can work miracles with dried fruit and a hot oven." The taciturn foreman actually blushed at the praise, ducking his head slightly. "It's nothing fancy," he muttered, but Catherine could see the pleasure her appreciative noises brought him as she tasted the surprisingly delicious dessert. After the meal, Blake insisted on carrying Emma while he escorted Catherine to Martha's cabin. The small structure stood about 100 yards from the main house, just as Blake had described, nestled against a stand of pines that provided a natural windbreak. Inside, the cabin was indeed a smaller version of Blake's home: one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bedroom visible through an open door. The furniture was simple but well made, and someone, Hank, she presumed, had placed fresh candles in the sconces and laid a fire that now burned cheerfully in the hearth. "It's perfect," Catherine said, meaning it. After the isolation of her previous home, the proximity to Blake's house felt reassuring rather than intrusive. "It needs some touches to make it truly comfortable," Blake said, looking around critically. "Curtains, maybe, some rugs, whatever women like to make a house feel like home." The casual statement sent an unexpected pang through Catherine's heart. How long had it been since she had thought about such simple pleasures as choosing curtain fabric or arranging a room to suit her own taste? James had been a good man, but the harsh realities of homesteading had left little time or resources for domestic comforts. "I'm sure it will be fine," she said, taking Emma from Blake's arms. The baby had fallen asleep, her small face peaceful in the firelight. Blake hesitated at the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. "I've asked Hank to ride into Silver Creek tomorrow. Let folks know you're here and that you're looking to teach." The preacher there, Reverend Collins, handles most community matters. He'll be pleased to hear about you." "Thank you," Catherine said, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what she had done, leaving everything familiar behind to follow this man to his home, putting her trust and Emma's future in his hands. "For everything." Blake nodded, his expression hidden in the shadows. "Get some rest, Catherine. Tomorrow's a new beginning for both of you." As the door closed behind him, Catherine stood for a long moment in the center of the cabin, Emma warm and heavy in her arms. A new beginning. The words echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed, laying Emma in the small crib that had appeared Blake's handiwork. She suspected and settling herself on the surprisingly comfortable mattress. Outside, the wind had picked up, but unlike in her old cabin, no drafts found their way through the walls here. The fire burned steadily, and the knowledge that Blake and Hank were just across the yard lent a security she hadn't felt in months. As sleep claimed her, Catherine's last thought was of Blake's face as he had welcomed her to his ranch, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet pride in his voice. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was no longer facing it alone. The following weeks brought a flurry of changes as Catherine and Emma settled into life at Callahan Ranch. True to Blake's word, Reverend Collins from Silver Creek had visited within days of their arrival, his weathered face alight with enthusiasm at the prospect of a qualified teacher for the settlement's growing population of children. "We've been praying for someone like you, Mrs. Miller," he told Catherine earnestly over coffee in Blake's kitchen. "The children are running wild as weeds, with no proper schooling since Miss Abernathy left last spring to marry a man from Helena." "How many children are there?" Catherine asked, already mentally cataloging what supplies she might need. 23 between the ages of 6 and 16, the Reverend replied. "Mostly from the farming and mining families, with a few from the businesses in town. We have a small building that served as a schoolhouse before, nothing fancy, but it has a good stove and decent windows." Catherine's heart quickened at the prospect. 23 children, a proper school, not just the occasional tutoring she had done back in Ohio. "When could I start?" Reverend Collins beamed at her eagerness. "As soon as you're settled, my dear, though the winter makes regular attendance difficult for the outlying farms. Perhaps after the next thaw." Blake, who had been quietly listening from his position by the fire, spoke up. "I could bring Catherine into town on Monday mornings and collect her Friday afternoons, weather permitting. She and Emma could stay at the boarding house during the week." The suggestion caught Catherine by surprise. They hadn't discussed such an arrangement before, and the thought of being separated from Blake for days at a time brought an unexpected twinge of something she wasn't ready to name. "That's very generous, Mr. Callahan," Reverend Collins said approvingly. "Though Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house charges a pretty penny these days." "The school board will provide a stipend, of course," Blake said firmly. $15 a month should cover room and board for both Mrs. Miller and the baby, with something left over. I'll make up any difference." Catherine opened her mouth to protest such generosity, but Blake silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. Later, when they were alone, she confronted him. "I can't let you pay for my board," she insisted, folding laundry while Emma napped in her crib. The domestic scene might have appeared ordinary to an observer, but Catherine's flushed cheeks and Blake's stubborn stance revealed the tension beneath. "It's not charity," Blake countered. "It's an investment in the community. Those children need education, and you need purpose beyond just surviving. Everyone benefits." "But your reputation," Blake's eyebrows rose. "My reputation? Catherine, I'm a grown man with my own property and business. I can help a widow and her child if I see fit." "That's just it," Catherine said, setting down the folded sheet with more force than necessary. I don't want to be seen as your charity case, your responsibility, the widow you rescued from certain death. Understanding dawned in Blake's eyes. You're worried about gossip. Of course I am. A woman in my position can't afford to be the subject of wagging tongues. Emma's future depends on my good name. Blake was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he nodded. You're right. I didn't think it through from your perspective. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought. What if we make it official? Make what official? Your position here. As the ranch's teacher. You could instruct Hank, the man can barely write his own name, and any of the hands who want learning, in exchange for room, board, and a small salary. All proper and businesslike. The solution was so simple, so perfect that Catherine could only stare at him in wonder. You do that. Blake's smile was gentle. Catherine, I do a lot more than that to see you and Emma settled and happy here, but this seems a good start. The warmth that spread through her at his words had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time since James's death, Catherine felt truly seen, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried, but as a woman with value and purpose. Thank you, she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate but unable to express the depth of her gratitude without revealing emotions she wasn't ready to acknowledge, even to herself. Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. So it's settled. You'll teach at Silver Creek during the week when weather permits, and here at the ranch when it doesn't. A proper contract with proper pay. And so it was arranged. By the time the worst of winter had passed, and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in late March, Catherine had established herself as both the settlement's schoolteacher and an unofficial member of the Callahan ranch household. The arrangement worked better than she could have hoped. 3 days a week, weather permitting, Blake or Hank would drive her into Silver Creek, where she taught in the small but adequate schoolhouse. The children, starved for education and structure, responded enthusiastically to her firm but kind approach. On weekends and during stormy periods, she returned to the ranch, where she held informal lessons for Hank and 2 of the younger hands who wanted to improve their reading and writing. Emma thrived in the new environment, growing plump and happy with the abundance of fresh milk from the ranch's cows and the constant attention from Blake, who seemed to delight in the baby's developing personality. He fashioned toys for her: a rocking horse, a set of wooden blocks, a small chair sized perfectly for her tiny frame, each gift crafted with meticulous care during the long winter evenings. Catherine tried not to read too much into his attentions. Blake was, by nature, a caretaker of his land, his animals, his employees. It was natural that this protective instinct would extend to Emma, a defenseless child who had captured his heart from their first meeting. But sometimes, when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, or when his hand lingered on hers as he helped her down from the wagon, Catherine wondered if there might be more to his feelings than mere kindness. The question remained unspoken between them, a delicate balance neither seemed willing to disturb. They settled into a comfortable routine, sharing meals, exchanging books, discussing the progress of her students and the affairs of the ranch. It was a partnership of sorts, practical, respectful, and increasingly essential to Catherine's sense of well-being. Spring came to Montana with sudden ferocity, the world transforming almost overnight from monochrome to vibrant color. The meadows surrounding the ranch exploded with wildflowers, and the cottonwoods along the creek unfurled tender green leaves that danced in the warming breeze. On a particularly fine Sunday in early May, Blake suggested a picnic by the creek that ran through the southern edge of his property. Emma should see more of the world than just cabins and schoolrooms, he said, already packing bread, cheese, and cold chicken into a basket. Catherine couldn't argue with his logic, and truth be told, she was eager for a change of scenery herself. The long winter had left her craving open spaces and fresh air, despite the relative comfort of her cabin. They rode double on Blake's gentlest mare, Emma securely nestled between them, her delighted squeals punctuating the journey as they crossed meadows dotted with lupine and Indian paintbrush. Blake pointed out landmarks as they rode the line between his property and the neighboring ranch, the distant mountains still capped with snow, the bend in the creek where he had built a small dam to create a swimming hole for the hot summer months. "It's beautiful," Catherine said honestly as they dismounted near a grove of cottonwoods. The creek chattered merrily over smooth stones, and a natural clearing in the trees provided the perfect spot for their blanket. "It's home," Blake replied simply, helping her down with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. The day passed in pleasant companionship, with Emma crawling happily on the blanket, fascinated by every leaf and stone within reach. Blake showed Catherine how to fashion a whistle from a willow branch, and she taught him a song she remembered from her own childhood, a simple tune about spring flowers that made Emma clap her hands in delight. As the afternoon waned and the shadows lengthened, Blake grew unusually quiet. He sat with his back against a tree trunk, watching Catherine braid wildflowers into a crown for Emma, his expression thoughtful. "Penny for your thoughts," Catherine said lightly, though something in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster. Blake seemed to come to a decision. He straightened, clearing his throat. "I've been thinking about the future," he said carefully. "Yours and Emma's and mine." Catherine's fingers stilled on the half-completed flower crown. "Oh. You've been here nearly 5 months now," Blake continued, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "You've made a place for yourself at the school, at the ranch. The folks in Silver Creek respect you, and Emma is thriving." "Thanks to you," Catherine acknowledged, unsure where this conversation was leading but suddenly nervous about its direction. Blake shook his head. "No, thanks to your strength and determination. I just provided a roof and some opportunities. You did the rest." He paused, then added more softly, "You're remarkable, Catherine Miller." The compliment brought warmth to her cheeks, and she busied herself with the flowers to hide her reaction. "What exactly are you saying, Blake?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump from a great height. "I'm saying that I care about you and Emma, more than I expected to. More than might be wise, given your circumstances." Catherine's heart seemed to stop, then restart at a gallop. She looked up to find Blake watching her intently, his blue eyes serious in the dappled sunlight. "I know it's too soon," he continued when she remained silent. "I know you're still grieving James, still finding your footing in this new life, and I'm not asking for anything right now except that you might consider the possibility of a future where your cabin isn't just a place you stay, but a home you share. With me." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and fragile as soap bubbles. Catherine stared at him, a tumult of emotions rising within her: surprise, confusion, fear, and underneath it all, a current of something warm and bright that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. "Blake, she began, not knowing how to finish the sentence. Emma chose that moment to topple sideways, letting out a frustrated cry as her tower of blocks collapsed. The interruption gave Catherine a moment to collect her scattered thoughts as she soothed her daughter. When she looked up again, Blake's expression had softened into a smile. "No need to answer now," he said gently. "Or even soon. I just wanted you to know where I stand. The rest is up to you." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their outward journey, but not uncomfortably so. Blake seemed content to have spoken his piece, making no demands for a response or commitment. Catherine was grateful for the reprieve, her mind whirling with the implications of his words. Could she consider a future with Blake Callahan? The man who had saved her and Emma from certain death, who had offered them not just shelter but purpose and dignity. The man whose quiet strength and unexpected tenderness had gradually worked their way past her grief and fear to touch something she had thought frozen forever. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun painting the buildings in gold and amber, Catherine found herself studying Blake's profile, the strong jaw, the lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the distance, the mouth that smiled so readily at Emma's antics. Yes, she realized with a clarity that took her breath away. Yes, she could imagine a future with this man. Perhaps she had been imagining it for longer than she cared to admit, even to herself. But there were complications. James's memory, Emma's need for stability, the expectations of the community, who might view a hasty remarriage as disrespectful or opportunistic. Blake helped her down from the horse when they reached the yard, his hands gentle but impersonal, as if he understood her need for space after his declaration. "Thank you for today," Catherine said, holding Emma on her hip. "It was lovely." Blake nodded, his eyes warm in the fading light. "Get some rest. I'll see you at breakfast." As she walked toward her cabin, Catherine felt his gaze on her back, patient and hopeful. She didn't turn around, not trusting herself to maintain the composure she desperately needed, while she sorted through her tangled emotions. Inside, as she prepared Emma for bed, Catherine found herself humming the spring song they had shared earlier, a simple melody about new beginnings and the rebirth that follows winter's coldest nights. Perhaps that was the answer, she thought as she tucked her drowsy daughter into her crib. Not a hasty decision made in the emotional aftermath of Blake's revelation, but a gradual unfolding like spring after winter, like a bud slowly opening to the sun's warmth. She would give herself time, and Blake, with his quiet patience, would give her that gift as well. Of this, she was certain. What Catherine hadn't anticipated was how Blake's declaration would change the texture of their daily interactions. Nothing obvious, he remained respectful, attentive, and careful not to press for a response, but a new awareness hummed between them, electric and undeniable. She found herself noticing details she had overlooked before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at Emma. How his hands, large and calloused from years of ranch work, could be impossibly gentle when bandaging a cut on her finger. The deep timbre of his voice when he read aloud in the evenings, a luxury they had begun to share as the spring nights lengthened. May turned to June, and the ranch burst into full summer glory. The cattle grew sleek on rich grass. The garden Blake had helped Catherine plant beside her cabin yielded its first tender vegetables, and Emma took her first tentative steps, lunging from Catherine's hands to Blake's waiting arms with peals of delighted laughter. "She's growing so fast," Blake observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple. Emma had fallen asleep on his chest, her small body rising and falling with each of his breaths. "Too fast," Catherine agreed, her heart full at the sight of her daughter so peacefully nestled against the man who had become such an essential part of their lives. "She'll be running before we know it. And talking," Blake added with a smile. "Heaven help us all when she starts asking questions." "She's got your curiosity, I can see it in her eyes." The casual us, the easy way he included himself in Emma's future, sent a warm glow through Catherine's chest. It felt right, this shared concern for her daughter's development, this partnership that had grown so naturally between them. "Blake," she began, her voice soft in the gathering twilight, About what you said at the creek." He turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral despite the sudden alertness in his posture. "Yes," Catherine took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about it. About us." And I think the sound of hoofbeats interrupted her, drawing their attention to the road where a rider approached at a gallop, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Blake gently transferred Emma to Catherine's arms and stood, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he said, his voice shifting from tender to commanding in an instant. Catherine watched as he strode into the yard to meet the rider, who reined in his lathered horse with a shower of dirt and gravel. Even from the porch, she could see the man's agitation, a young cowhand from the Silver Creek settlement, if she wasn't mistaken. Their conversation was brief and too distant for Catherine to hear clearly, but Blake's stiffening posture told her the news wasn't good. After a moment, he nodded sharply and the rider wheeled his horse around, galloping back the way he had come. When Blake returned to the porch, his expression was grim. "There's trouble in town. A gang of rustlers hit the Thompson place last night, stole a dozen head and shot old man Thompson when he tried to stop them. Is he alive, but badly hurt? The doctor's with him now." Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "Sheriff's forming a posse to go after the rustlers. They were heading this way according to the tracks." Catherine clutched Emma closer, suddenly aware of their vulnerability. "Are we in danger?" Blake shook his head. "Not likely. They're after cattle, not cabins." "But I need to ride with the posse they're gathering at dawn." He looked down at Emma, still sleeping peacefully despite the tension crackling in the air. "Hank will stay here with you and the other hands. Keep the doors locked at night until we get back." "How long will you be gone?" Catherine asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "Hard to say. A few days, maybe a week if the trail's difficult to follow." Blake's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "Don't worry. This isn't the first gang of rustlers to come through these parts, and we know how to handle them." But as he helped her carry Emma back to their cabin and made sure everything was secure for the night, Catherine couldn't shake the cold dread that had settled in her stomach. The Montana Territory, for all its beauty, remained a wild and dangerous place. Men like Blake stood between that wilderness and the fragile communities trying to take root in its soil, men who risked their lives to uphold the thin veneer of law and order. What if he didn't come back? The thought ambushed her as she watched him check the windows and door latches with methodical care. What if this was their last evening together, and she had never told him how she felt? "Blake," she said impulsively as he prepared to leave, "be careful. Please." He turned at the door, his expression softening as he took in her worried face. "Always am, Catherine. Don't fret, I've got too much to come back for." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet certainty, brought tears to her eyes. Before she could think better of it, Catherine crossed the room and laid her hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin and the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "I never thanked you properly," she whispered, "for saving us that night, for everything since." Blake's eyes darkened, and he covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss against her palm, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "No thanks needed. Having you and Emma here, it's made this place a home in a way it never was before." Catherine swallowed hard, knowing she should step back, maintain the careful distance they had established, but finding herself unwilling to break this fragile moment of connection. "What I was trying to say earlier, before we were interrupted," Blake shook his head gently. "Tell me when I get back," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Give me something to hold onto out there." He leaned forward then, slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wished, and pressed his lips to her forehead, a benediction, a promise, a question all in one. When he straightened, his eyes held hers for a long moment, communicating what words could not. Then, with a final nod, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Catherine stood motionless in the center of the cabin, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched her skin, her heart pounding with emotions too complex to name. "Come back to me," she whispered to the empty room. "Come back, and I'll tell you everything." The days of Blake's absence stretched interminably. Catherine threw herself into her teaching and garden, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emma's sake while anxiety gnawed at her insides. Hank and the other hands kept a vigilant watch over the ranch, but no rustlers appeared, and no news came from the posse. On the fifth day, just as Catherine was putting Emma down for her afternoon nap, she heard the thunder of hooves in the yard. Her heart leapt into her throat as she hurried to the window, praying to see Blake's tall figure among the returning riders. But it was only two men, the sheriff and his deputy, their faces grim with exhaustion, and something else that made Catherine's blood run cold. She pressed a hand to her mouth, willing herself not to assume the worst as she watched Hank stride out to meet them. Their conversation was brief, the sheriff gesturing emphatically toward the southeast while Hank listened intently, his normally impassive face betraying increasing concern. When the lawman had ridden off again, Hank stood for a long moment staring after them, then turned toward Catherine's cabin with a determined stride. She met him at the door, not bothering to hide her fear. "What is it? Is Blake?" "He's alive," Hank said quickly, correctly interpreting her most pressing concern. "But there's trouble. The rustlers split up, and Blake and 3 others followed one group into the Badlands. There was a shootout yesterday at dawn. One of our men was killed, and Blake took a bullet in the shoulder." Catherine's knees weakened, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "How bad?" Sheriff said it looked clean through and through, but Blake refused to turn back. They were closing in on the rustlers when the sheriff left them to report back and gather supplies. Hank's weathered face softened slightly at Catherine's distress. "Blake Callahan is the toughest man I know, Mrs. Miller. He'll be all right." But Catherine couldn't share his confidence. She had seen too many seemingly minor wounds fester and kill during the war, when she had volunteered at a field hospital in Ohio, and out in the Badlands with no proper medical care. "I'm going to him," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind with absolute clarity. Hank's eyebrows shot up. "Begging your pardon, madam, but that's impossible. The Badlands are no place for a woman, especially not with a baby, and the boss would have my hide if I let you put yourself in danger." "Then Emma will stay here with you," Catherine countered, her mind racing ahead to practical considerations. "She knows you, and she's been taking cow's milk well enough that she can manage for a few days without me." "Mrs. Miller?" "I was a nurse during the war, Hank," Catherine interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I know how to treat gunshot wounds, how to prevent infection. Blake needs that knowledge more than he needs me safe at home, waiting for news that might come too late." The foreman stared at her, clearly torn between his responsibility to protect her and the undeniable logic of her argument. Finally, he sighed heavily. "The boss is going to kill me for this," he muttered. "But if you're determined, I can't stop you short of locking you in this cabin, which I reckon would be disrespectful to a lady of your standing." Relief flooded through Catherine. "Thank you, Hank. I'll need supplies, clean bandages, alcohol, needle and thread for stitching if necessary. And food for the journey." Hank nodded, resigned to her decision. "I'll have everything ready by dawn. Pete will guide you. He knows the Badlands better than anyone except the boss." "But Mrs. Miller," he added, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You should know that where you're heading. It's dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with rustlers. The land itself can kill if you don't respect it." "I understand," Catherine said, though in truth, she knew her understanding was limited. She had never ventured far from the ranch or Silver Creek, had never seen the harsh beauty of the Badlands that Blake had occasionally described during their evening conversations. But none of that mattered. Blake was hurt, possibly dying, and she had the skills to help him. The rest was irrelevant. As she packed a small bag and prepared Emma for an extended separation, the first since her birth, Catherine found herself thinking of that night months ago when Blake had appeared at her cabin door like an answer to an unspoken prayer. He had wrapped her and Emma in his coat and his arms, sheltering them from a storm that would surely have claimed their lives. Now it was her turn to go to him, to offer whatever protection and comfort she could against the storm he faced. And perhaps, if God was merciful, to finally tell him what she had realized that evening on the porch. That somewhere between gratitude and admiration, between respect and friendship, she had fallen irrevocably in love with Blake Callahan. The thought should have frightened her, this second chance at love she had never expected or sought. Instead, it filled her with a calm determination that carried her through the night's preparations, and the heart-wrenching moment of leaving Emma in Hank's surprisingly capable hands. "I'll be back as soon as I can, my darling," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's downy head. "Be good for Hank. Mama loves you more than anything in this world." As she mounted the sturdy mare Hank had saddled for her and followed Pete out of the ranch yard in the gray light of dawn, Catherine sent up a silent prayer. "Let me reach him in time. Let me have the chance to tell him what he means to us. Let us find our way home together." The journey to the Badlands was more arduous than Catherine had anticipated. Despite Pete's careful guidance and consideration for her less experienced riding abilities, they traveled southeast through increasingly rugged terrain, the lush grasslands of the ranch giving way to scrubby brush, and eventually to the stark, otherworldly landscape that gave the Badlands their name. Towering rock formations in shades of rust, ochre, and cream rose from the parched earth like the spires of some ancient, forgotten cathedral. Deep ravines cut through the land, their shadowed depths hiding springs and unexpected patches of greenery. The beauty was alien and unsettling, a reminder that this country had existed long before human settlement and would endure long after. "We're getting close," Pete said late on the second day, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from a canyon ahead. "That'll be their camp." Catherine's heart leapt into her throat. After 2 days of dust, heat, and anxiety, the prospect of finally reaching Blake left her dizzy with anticipation and fear. What if they were too late? What if his wound had worsened beyond her ability to treat? Pete seemed to sense her thoughts. "The boss is tough as old leather, madam. Takes more than a bullet to keep him down." His words were meant to be reassuring, but Catherine had seen too many tough men succumb to infection and fever during the war to take comfort in them. Still, she nodded gratefully, appreciating the young cowhand's attempt to ease her worry. They approached the camp cautiously, aware that the posse might mistake them for the rustlers they were pursuing. Pete hallooed from a safe distance, identifying himself and Catherine to the sentries posted at the canyon entrance. The camp itself was a sparse affair, 4 horses picketed near a small stream, bedrolls arranged around a modest fire, and a crude lean-to constructed from branches and a canvas tarp. Under this makeshift shelter, a man lay stretched on a bedroll, his face turned away from their approach. Catherine's breath caught. Even from a distance, she would know Blake's form anywhere: the broad shoulders, the long legs, the dark hair now matted with dust and sweat. She dismounted before Pete could help her, her legs protesting after 2 days in the saddle, and hurried toward the lean-to. The sheriff intercepted her, his expression a mixture of surprise and relief. "Mrs. Miller, what in tarnation are you doing out here?" "I came to help," she said simply, trying to see past him to Blake. "I have medical experience. Please let me see him." The sheriff hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "He's been asking for you," he admitted quietly. "Thought it was the fever talking." Catherine's heart clenched at the implication Blake was delirious, calling for her in his pain. She moved past the sheriff, dropping to her knees beside the makeshift bed. Blake lay on his uninjured side, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and too rapid. The bandage wrapped around his left shoulder was stained with blood and yellow discharge, clear signs of infection. "Blake," she said softly, laying a cool hand against his cheek. "I'm here." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening in disbelief as they fixed on her face. "Catherine," his voice was a hoarse whisper. "Am I dreaming?" "No," she assured him, already reaching for her bag of medical supplies. "I'm really here, and I'm going to help you, but you need to lie still." A ghost of his familiar smile touched his cracked lips. "Bossy woman," he murmured, but there was affection in the words despite his obvious pain. Catherine worked methodically, cutting away the soiled bandage to reveal the angry red wound beneath. The bullet had indeed passed through his shoulder, as Hank had said, but the exit wound was inflamed and seeping, classic signs of a developing infection. "I need to clean this properly," she told the sheriff, who hovered anxiously nearby. "Boil water as much as you can. And I'll need someone to hold him down. This will be painful." The next hour was a blur of focused activity as Catherine cleaned the wound with alcohol, drained the infection, and stitched both entry and exit points with neat, careful sutures. Blake remained conscious throughout, his jaw clenched against the pain, his eyes never leaving her face even as sweat poured down his temples. Only when she had finished bandaging his shoulder with clean linen, and helped him swallow a mixture of willow bark tea, for the fever, did Catherine allow herself to acknowledge the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "You need rest," Blake said, his voice stronger now though still rough with pain. His good hand captured hers, his grip surprisingly firm despite his weakened state. "You rode all this way." "Of course I did," Catherine replied, smoothing damp hair from his forehead. "Did you think I would stay home and wait while you were hurt?" A shadow crossed Blake's face. "Emma is safe with Hank. She'll be fine for a few days without me." Catherine squeezed his hand reassuringly. "My place was here with you." Blake's eyes, fever bright but lucid, searched her face. "Why?" The simple question hung between them, laden with meaning that transcended their current circumstances. Catherine knew he wasn't asking about her medical skills or her decision to leave Emma temporarily. He was asking about the emotion that had driven her across miles of dangerous territory to reach him, the feeling neither of them had yet named aloud. "Because," she said softly, holding his gaze steadily, "I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Because Emma needs you. Because I need you." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Because I love you, Blake Callahan. I think perhaps I have since that first night when you wrapped us both in your coat and made us feel safe for the first time in so long." Blake's eyes widened, then filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. His hand tightened on hers. "Say it again," he whispered. Catherine smiled through the tears that suddenly blurred her vision. "I love you. And if you'll still have me have us when you're well again, I'd like nothing more than to make a life with you. A real life, not just an arrangement of convenience." Despite his obvious pain, Blake's face transformed with joy. "Catherine Miller," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. I have loved you since I saw you standing in that doorway, freezing half to death but still proud as a queen. I loved you when you first smiled at me across your cabin table. I loved you when you trusted me enough to follow me to the ranch. And I love you now more than ever for coming after me when any sensible woman would have stayed safe at home." Catherine laughed softly, tears spilling freely now. "I've never claimed to be sensible where you're concerned." "Thank God for that," Blake murmured, tugging gently on her hand until she leaned down, bringing her face close to his. "Now, if you love me as you say, would you be so kind as to kiss me? I find myself at a disadvantage for initiating such things at the moment." Catherine hesitated only briefly, acutely aware of the sheriff and his men just outside the lean-to. But the naked longing in Blake's eyes overcame her last vestiges of propriety. She bent and pressed her lips to his gently at first, mindful of his weakened state, then with growing confidence as his good arm came up to cradle the back of her neck. The kiss was everything she had imagined in her most secret thoughts, and more tender yet passionate, a promise and a fulfillment all at once. When they finally parted, both breathless despite the brevity of the contact, Blake's eyes held a depth of emotion that made Catherine's heart swell with answering joy. "When we get home," he said softly, "when I'm healed and can do this properly, I'm going to ask you to marry me, Catherine Miller." "Just so you're prepared," Catherine smiled, brushing a gentle finger along his jawline. "And just so you're prepared, Blake Callahan, my answer will be yes." The journey back to the ranch was slow and careful, with frequent stops to rest Blake and change his bandages. The rustlers had been captured by another portion of the posse and were being transported to the territorial prison, their threat to the community eliminated for now. Catherine rode beside the wagon where Blake lay, watching him constantly for signs of returning fever or increased pain. But her careful cleaning of the wound and the stitches she had placed seemed to be holding, the infection receding with each passing day. They talked during these long hours on the trail about the future they now openly acknowledged wanting to build together, about Emma and the siblings they hoped to give her, about the ranch and the school and the life they would share. "I want to adopt Emma," Blake said on the third day as they stopped for a noon rest in the shade of a cottonwood grove. "Legally, I mean, if that's all right with you. I know she has her father's name now, but James would want her to have a father who loves her," Catherine interrupted gently, moved beyond words by the request. "Nothing would make me happier than for her to be a Callahan, just like her mother will be." Blake's smile was radiant despite his still pallid complexion. "Catherine Callahan," he said, testing the name. "It has a fine sound to it." "Yes," she agreed, taking his hand in hers. "Yes, it does." They were married in the small church in Silver Creek on a perfect autumn day, with Emma toddling down the aisle ahead of Catherine, scattering wildflower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The entire settlement turned out for the celebration, along with ranchers from miles around who had come to respect Blake Callahan's integrity and Catherine's dedication to their children's education. Reverend Collins beamed as he pronounced them man and wife, and Hank, standing proudly as Blake's best man, actually shed a tear when Blake kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the strength of his arms around her. The reception at the ranch afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Blake had insisted on doing things properly, wanting Catherine to have the celebration she had missed in her hasty first marriage. As the last guests departed, and the newlyweds stood on the porch of the main house now their house, Blake wrapped his arm around Catherine's waist, drawing her close against his side. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Catherine leaned into his embrace, watching as Hank carried a sleeping Emma toward the small cabin that would now serve as the foreman's quarters. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Blake turned her in his arms, his eyes serious in the gathering dusk. "Catherine, when I found you that night, I was a man with a ranch but no real home. You and Emma changed that. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving and accumulating land and cattle." He touched her cheek gently. "You brought me back to life as surely as I kept you from freezing that night." Catherine's heart swelled with love for this man who had become the center of her world, this strong, gentle cowboy who had wrapped her and her baby in his coat and his arms, sheltering them from the cold of winter and the harsher chill of loneliness and fear. "Then we saved each other," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "And we'll keep on doing so every day for the rest of our lives." Blake's arms tightened around her, his kiss deepening with a promise of the night to come there first as husband and wife, the first of countless nights they would share in the home they had built together from necessity, respect, friendship, and finally, most perfectly, love. As stars appeared in the vast Montana sky above them, Catherine Miller Callahan sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought Blake to her door that winter night, for the courage that had allowed her to trust him, and for the love that had blossomed between them against all odds. Their story, she knew, was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more joys, more children to expand their family. But whatever came, they would face it together strong, united, and wrapped in the enduring warmth of a love born on the coldest of nights.